So hi, I'm Joe Insley from Argonne National Lab. Work in the Argonne Leadership Computing Facility there. And so I'm just going to, well, here's our sort of plan for the next hour. Just to give some examples of some of the types of visualization that our team has worked on. Talk a little bit about visualization resources at scale. And then talk a little bit about data and transformations and some of the tools and formats, visualization formats that we use. Talk a little bit about the different types of data representations that we can have, and talk a little bit about some production viz. So some activities for doing that. So here's this first example is of arterial blood flow, and this is a team that's looking at blood flow in the brain, and they're interested in interactions of large, mixing different scales of simulation. And so in particular, this is an example of arterial flow in the brain, and this particular patient, it's taken from real patient MRI data, and they have an aneurysm in the brain. So which is what this little balloon thing that's kind of sticking out there is. And they're interested in how the large scale flow patterns affect small scale events like particle buildup on the wall of the aneurysm. And we'll talk a little bit more about this. I have another talk a little bit later in the session, and we'll go in a little bit more detail about this project. Another example is climate. In this particular, they started with historical data and looked at, for looking at their initial conditions, and then they have a number of different models for precipitation and ice and temperature and different parts of the environment that they coupled together. And this particular one was, at the time, it's about a couple years old now, but for the resolution that it's at is an eighth of a degree of resolution. So at the time, for doing essentially global climate at that resolution, it's the highest resolution that was done at the time, and it's still sort of a benchmark application. Another one is aerospace. So we work with, in addition to other resource labs, national labs, and universities, at Argonne we have some corporate folks that work and do large-scale simulation. And this is an example from General Electric, who produces, engineer-produced jet engines. And so they're using compute facilities to look at how to reduce noise and in turn produce better fuel efficiency in their jet engines. So there's various material sciences folks that are looking at molecular structures, nanoparticles. These are just a couple examples of those. And actually, Aaron is going to talk a little bit more about material science visualization this afternoon, give you some more examples of some work that's been done in that area. Cosmology, this is an example of a dark matter simulation. And so the brighter cluster, the spots that you see there are where there's clusters of particles that are forming galaxies. And this is from a very large scale dark matter particle simulation of evolution of the universe. And I'll talk a little bit more about this a little bit later as well. This is another example of astrophysics data, and this is one where we're actually doing some comparative visualization. So this is, they actually ran two separate simulations that had the same initial conditions, and they included different science and different physics in the actual simulation. And so what we're looking at here is actually the difference between the two simulations. And so if you look at the scale there, the place where it's blue is where the two simulations are the same, and the darker red regions were dominated by one computation, and the yellow regions were dominated by the other. And this is just an example of as it's evolves over time. And these were done using volume rendering, and I'll talk a little bit more about that and some of the other types of data representations that we have. So a little bit about visualization resources. So generally, it's common for high-performance computing centers to have a large-scale visualization resource, an analysis that they couple with their compute resource. This is an example of Tukey, which is our machine at Argonne. And it's a high-end cluster. It's got 96 nodes. Each node has 16 CPU cores, a bunch of memory, 2 visualization cards, graphics cards in it. And one of probably one of the most important features of it is that you see it's cross-mounted in the file system with Mira. So they share a file system such that when you're running your simulation on Mira, you write or whatever your local compute resource is, you write, in this case, Mira, you were writing the data to disk, and then you can read it back directly into on Tukey. And so you don't have to move large chunks of data around, which is often one of the biggest bottlenecks in terms of doing visualization and analysis in general. When you're writing the data to the disk is often the biggest bottleneck. So if you can reduce the amount of times that you need to move it around, that's usually a good thing. And I'll also say, of course, that there's a lot of work that's been going into looking at, because that's such a bottleneck, looking at doing in situ visualization, which is where you try and do the visualization and analysis either on the compute resource itself while it's still in memory, so you don't have to write data to disk, or potentially on a visualization cluster such as this that's co-located, connected via high-speed network, so you can move data quickly between the resources, avoid having to do the step of writing it to disk, which again is the slowest part. And there's a number of different efforts in the community that are looking at different ways to do that, and you'll hear more about that this afternoon as well. So switching gears a little bit, so visualization algorithms. So how are we actually going to compute and change this data in order to make it, in order to visualize it? And so if we think of visualization algorithms or transformations, they're sort of divided into 2 main sort of ways we think about it. And one is structure. So, and within structure, when we change it, we talk about changing it geometrically in terms of translating, rotating, scaling the coordinates. In that case, the topology itself remains unchanged. So, for instance, how vertices of a mesh, for example, are connected to one another. Those parts of it don't change, but the position of those vertices may. And then we also think about attributes, so transforming or creating new types of data attributes. And then the other thing that we look at is the type, whether it's a scalar field, so it's a single value per either mesh point or particle, or however we're looking at data, or a vector, meaning an array of values, or a tensor, or some combination of those. So when we start looking at data at the large scale, we need to start thinking about data decomposition. And there's a number of different ways that you can do that. This is an example of a regular grid. And of course, that means the grid is regularly sized, regularly spaced grid of cells. And each one holds a single value per variable. And so when we want to try and divide that between processes, because often the data is such that it's not going to fit in memory on a single machine. So we divide that up among the different processors or processes on the compute resource. And then, of course, we need to include some ghost cells. And this is required to ensure accuracy. Maybe this is review for some of you in terms of this is the same type of thing that you need to do when you're doing data decomposition for simulations, for doing the simulation, and the same types of decompositions are required in order to do visualization as well. Of course, these ghost cells are going to happen all over. And then things that I'll go in a little bit of detail here is why that's necessary and how this is helpful. So if you think about this grid of values, and each one of these points as a single value for their entire cell. But what if I want to look at the values between cells, somewhere like along this line here? Well, so if I want to do it right in the middle here, that's pretty easy. I can just interpolate between those two values, right? Between 2 and 4 is 3. There we go. Between 6 and 8 is 7. But what if I want to do here? And so initially you'd think, oh, great, that's just 5. But if these two parts of the grid happen to live on different processors, then I don't know what my neighbor has. So the guy that holds 4 and the guy that holds 6 don't know about each other. So, there's going to be a jump in that value. But if instead we add some ghost cells, and so now as part of my computation, I'm not actually going to so the guy that's doing this side is not actually going to render this side, but I'm going to hold this side so that I know what the value is. So now when I try and do that interpolation, I know the neighboring value. And I can get the right thing. So now I have a smooth transition between those values. So another example of a different way to decompose the domain is adaptive mesh refinement, which you may have heard about. And so essentially what it does is it puts more detail in regions where things are changing more rapidly or more quickly. And this can increase both computational performance and result in a smaller data set. So for example, I can keep subdividing this data set, this grid, into smaller regions where things are changing more quickly. But so for example, up in this upper right corner, this big area, if I were to evenly subdivide this whole domain evenly to the same resolution that I have in this small subregion down here, it would take 64 I'd have to do 64 calculations and hold 64 different values, when if I know that they're going to be the same value because it's not changing throughout that space, I can reduce that to a single calculation, single value. So again, that's going to help to increase our performance. We'll be able to do that much more quickly, and the resulting data will also be smaller. So here's just an example of that. Hard to see here, but the top half of that is actually red. And so that's obviously a pretty big space. So that can be represented in only a few values. And then here, as we have this burning front moving along in this calculation, you see there's areas here where there's lots of change going on, sort of along these little filaments along the burning front. And so those are where there's going to be more concentration of grid points, and you're going to have much finer resolution in those places. And then ultimately, obviously here, things are going on all over the place, but and so it's going to be the grid is going to be fairly well refined in most places, but getting to that point, we can get to that point much quicker because in the earlier time steps where there was large regions that were not that didn't need to be as well refined, we can do those calculations faster. Another example of domain decomposition, particle-based. So in these types of calculations, each particle carries information about itself, and it moves around in the domain. And then there's a number of different ways that you can decompose that. So for example, each process could be responsible for some set of the particles where it doesn't matter where they're located in the domain. But they each process keeps track of some predefined set of particles. Or it could be such that each process is responsible for particles within a particular region in the domain. So when you start thinking about those differences, one of the things that we need to be cognizant of is trying to figure out how to load balance. So each of those have some trade-offs. So for example, if each particle, each process is going to be responsible for a particular region of particles. You can see obviously there's a whole lot more particles going on up here, not a whole lot down here. So this process that's responsible for this region is going to finish obviously a lot faster than this one. So he's going to be spending a lot of time idle. And that's one of the things that we try to avoid, right? So we want to try and figure out different ways of balancing that such that all the processes are kept busy for the same amount of time. One of the other ways to do that decomposition, like I said, is to have each process responsible for a certain set of particles. But if they're moving around and they're much further, some of the particles are scattered further away, the particles that are near it are going to be influencing it most. So then there's going to be a lot of communication that's required to talk to the other processes that are responsible for those particles. And so again, there's a trade-off in terms of performance and doing load balancing that you need to think about. And again, I talked about there's a number of efforts looking at doing in situ analysis and data reduction in order to do some of the processing, the visualization and analysis actually on the resource, the compute resource itself, while the simulation is still going on. And this is an example where what they're interested in is, in particular, things that are happening where this white surface is. And they know at the beginning, before they even start the calculation, that this is going to be the region of interest, and they know what this value is. So while they're running the simulation, they can calculate this surface, and then they can look at the rest of the data, and as they're processing it, they can do some data reduction in areas that are further away from this surface. So when they do some data compression and compress the data that's further away, and they're able to set this example, they were able to attain a compression of 20 to 30 times while still keeping the same amount of fidelity in the regions that were most important. So there's all sorts of tools for doing visit analysis. There's visualization applications like Visit and ParaView, and you'll hear more about those coming up. And those are sort of general purpose tools. And others are very domain specific. So they're capabilities for looking at some of the specifics of that are visualizing data that's from a specific domain, and they have some very specific needs. And then there's also APIs for doing programming APIs that enabling you to write your own sort of tools. Some that have leverage the GPU for performance and do acceleration that way. And then there's different analysis environments like MATLAB and Parallel R, utilities for doing some graphing and image processing, and so forth. So a little bit about, like I mentioned, Visit and ParaView are sort of two of the standards that we use. They're general purpose visualization applications, and so they enable you to do all types of different viz for. And they have a lot of the same capabilities as each other, and some of the things enable you to do a lot of the things that I'm going to walk through next in terms of different types of visualization. And they're not necessarily domain specific. They're types of things that you need to do across lots of different domains. They're GUI based, so they have graphical interfaces, but they're also scriptable so that you can run things in batch mode, for example. And they're extendable, which is great because, and we'll show some examples of that later on today as well. So if it doesn't currently do something that you need it to do, they're pretty easy to expand. And again, they're both largely built on top of VTK, which VTK itself is a programming environment or an API. So it provides a lot of additional capabilities and some finer control in places. But it requires a lot more expertise. So you basically are building custom applications or or custom plugins for some of these other tools. In terms of file format, now this is by no means an exhaustive list, but typically when the data format is optimized for your simulation, right? So you want to take best advantage of the compute resource you can when you're doing simulation. So the data structures that you use are going to be optimized for memory access and moving data around and such. So, and that format is usually very different from what you need in order to do visualization. So these are a number of the, again, not exhaustive list, but some examples of different types of data file formats that are popular with both Visit and ParaView and other types of visualization packages as well. So a little bit about we call it data wrangling. So basically, like I said, a lot of time is spent because the formats between simulation and Viz are often very different. We spend a lot of time doing that conversion. So XDMF is a great tool for that, which is basically an XML wrapper around HDF5, which I don't know if you've heard about HDF5 at all this week, but it's basically a format for describing large-scale data, and it's a way of storing and describing that. So there's an XML wrapper around that can find different types of data sets and visit, and then you can use that same format essentially that you're using in your simulation, and use this XML description to sort of describe what's in this large data set. And do those sort of conversions on the fly. There's also obviously Visualization Toolkit, VTK, which you could add to your simulation code to write out data in that format, or you can write utilities to convert between simulation format and VTK. Or you could write your own readers, custom routines, to read those into different packages. And there are C++ and Python bindings for VTK that makes that process a little easier. In terms of data organization, so the format, like I mentioned, there's lots of different formats that we just looked at a second ago, and there's existing tools support many of those flavors of that. So you could either use one of these formats directly, or you could either use or write a format converter to convert from your simulation format to visualization formats. Again, you could write a custom reader for an existing tool, or write your own custom visualization tools, for example, again, using VTK or OpenGL. And then one thing I'll say a little bit about serial versus parallel or partitioned. So this is basically the difference between having a single big file that holds all your data versus having many small files. And often someplace in the middle is going to be sort of the sweet spot to have. Because if you have one really large file and you're running on a large number of processes, having all those processes reading from a single file, you can run into performance issues. And likewise, if you have a lot of very small files and a lot of processes accessing a very large number of small files, that can also lead to bottlenecks in the I/O. So somewhere in the middle is generally best. There's different, all the VTK data types support both parallel and serial files. XDMF, again, can support that for Visit and ParaView, or you could write your own custom one. And we've done that in the past, where we've wrote a little XML description that talks about, looks at regular grid data that's stored in a small number of files rather than one big file. Sure.
Do you have a particular size at which, like, what would be many small files and what would like a number?
So depending on the application and the size of your large data set, 100 files, 1,000 files is maybe okay. But if, for example, if you're running a large simulation that's running on 300,000 processors, you probably don't want to write a file per process at that scale. Right. So someplace,
So up to 10,000 should still be okay, or?
Potentially. It depends, I think, a lot on the resource that you're using and some of the characteristics of the hardware that's being used in the file system. And so that's one of the things so 10,000 could be okay depending on how many processes are reading it, for example. And so those are some of the things that you have to, there's not a specific correct answer for that, but that's one of the things you need to consider.
Just going to comment that for general strategy, just make sure you're not dumping all those files in the same directory. Most file systems.
Sure.
Right. Right. So in terms of talking about some of the performance trade-offs. So, for example, VTK within ParaView, at least some of the parallel readers, or some of when you run it in parallel, serial files are often all read in on the head node, and then the head node repartitions the data and distributes it to the rest of the nodes, and that can be problematic. Whereas if it's a VTK parallel file, which is basically the parallel file has a bunch of metadata in it that describes essentially a bunch of serial files that are partitioned that create one large data set. And so if it's saved as a partitioned parallel file, VTK and ParaView can read those files distributed across processes and actually read them in parallel versus read them all in one node and then redistribute. So an example of performance, this is a small test I did some time ago, and where I had a serial unstructured grid file of modest size. It was a little under 4 gigabytes. When I ran that on 64 processes, it took more than 15 minutes. I didn't keep that close to track, but more than 15 minutes to read and distribute it. So most of the time was spent doing the partitioning and redistributing. But then I took that same data and saved it into a parallel VTU file, parallel unstructured grid. Data size grew a little bit because there was, and this was partitioned in the same number of partitions, 64. So there's a bunch of extra information in terms of ghost cells that are between partitions and such. So the data size grew a little bit. But when I tried to read in that same data set on 64 processes, it took under a second. So you can see there's some advantages to, and maybe a little bit of trade-off, right? Because the data size did grow some, but we earned it back in the performance. So back to some more specifically looking at visualization. There's a number of visual cues that have been recognized as ways that we look at understanding our data. And these are examples taken from a book called Data Points from Nathan Yao. And so he talks about different ways of distinguishing your data. So position, where it is things are in space relative to each other. Length, so how long your shapes are relative to one another. Angle of rotation between vectors is another example. The slope of a vector, so basically direction that something is pointing. Excuse me. Using symbols as categories, so distinguishing shapes from one another. Area, how much 2D space something takes up, or volume, how much 3D space. And then there's two different aspects of color, the intensity of a color hue, and the color hue itself, which is usually referred to as the color. So these are some considerations to think about when you're looking at trying to assign, trying to differentiate in your data. So there's a number of different types of representations that we can do. One of them is called volume rendering, and this is where essentially you assign a color and a transparency to data in a volume. And you use a transfer function to map voxel density to color and opacity. And one of the things you can do there is, for example, you can say that values within a certain range and assign a particular color or range of colors to data that's in a particular range. So, for example, this little mouse guy here. So we can see here are bones or cartilage. And so the density of those are in an unknown range. So we can assign a particular color for bones, and maybe this is some other tissue or muscle or cartilage, and that fall within a particular range, and you can assign different color values to ranges of data values. Similarly here, this is this T-junction where there's two fluids that are mixing. Obviously, red would be hot, blue is colder, and as they mix together, you can see the regions where they're mixed are white. And so using color to represent, ranges of color to represent different types of, ranges of values in the data. So I'll talk a little bit about, in terms of volume rendering, sort of how this sort of works. And so it's a method for taking 2- and 3-dimensional data sets and turning them into 2D images. And so there's a number of different algorithms and methods for doing this. And generally, there's sort of a payoff between accuracy and performance. And so there's one approximation method that we use often, which is called volume ray casting. And so the idea there is for every pixel in your image, you're going to cast a ray through the volume of data and take samples along that ray. And so for each of those samples, we look up the data. We take the data value at that sample, and we look it up in a color table like this one across the top here. And so here, values that are lower are going to be in the blue end, and as the value goes higher, comes to descend towards red. And what this white line across the center is a transfer function, which tells it how much transparency it should have, or actually how much opacity. So the lower that line is, the more transparent the sample is. The higher the line is, the more opaque it is. And so we do that for every pixel in the image. And then again, when we're doing this in parallel, we subdivide that volume among different processes. And I'm not showing it here, but this is where those ghost cells would come into play, so that the regions between the boundaries of between the nodes doesn't end up showing breaks. And so then each node, when this is done in parallel, would render a different chunk, and then those individual chunks would then get reassembled and composited into a final image. So another type of data representation is glyphs, and this is where you take a 2D or 3D geometric object to represent some point data, either a particle or perhaps a vertice on a mesh. And the location is dictated by the coordinate. So again, the location on a 3D mesh, position in a 2D table, for example. And then you take graphical attributes and apply them to different attributes in the data. So in this case, for example, this cylinder here, we have a bunch of vectors, and the arrows are pointing in the direction that the vector is. And they're also colored by their velocity, which is also represented in this top image here. And this is looking at down the end of the cylinder. And here they're just represented as spheres, not as arrows, but they're colored by their velocity. And so you can see that the color goes from blue is slow to red is faster. And this is shows an example of sort of how you represent the data that sort of verifying that you get the example, the answer that you were expecting, where particles that are on the these are particles moving through a tube. The slower ones around the perimeter are bumping into the wall of the tube and slowing down, and the ones in the center are moving faster because they're not inhibiting that friction. Some additional examples of glyphs. And so Visit and ParaView are both very good at this type of representing glyphs. VDK is also very good at it, but again, it requires a little more effort. gnuplot is another tool that I haven't mentioned yet, but it's more of a command line driven tool, and it's good for doing 2D plots of tables and numbers. So for example, all these little shapes would be considered a glyph in terms of these lines. So another type of data representation is contours or isosurfaces or isolines, which basically represents a constant value through a field or through a space. And again, Visit and ParaView both good at this. VTK again is the same, but it requires more effort. And so this is an example where, so for instance in 2D, where this line is where the value in this field crosses some threshold. And similarly in the other two, but in 3D. Cutting planes is another data representation. So you take a slice of plane through the data set, and then you can apply additional visualization methods on that resulting plane. So for example, here in this bottom example, and actually this comes from an example I'll talk about, the blood flow example I'll talk a little bit more about later, but on this plane, it's a slice through a mesh, and the arrows are points in that cross section, and there's a vector field there, and so we're adding the vectors that fall on that slice to show the direction that a flow is moving on that slice. So that's one way of sort of combining multiple types of representations into single visualization of the same data. Streamlines is another representation. This is from a vector field on a mesh. So you need connectivity in order to do this. And it shows the direction that an element's going to travel at any point in time. Again, all those tools are good at this, but so this gives an example of when we take a snapshot or look at a single time step, and you start with a number of seed points, and then you follow the vector through and go to the next position that vector points to, and then when you get to the next one, you say, okay, well, where does it go from here? And you can see the types of paths that data takes through a data set. As I mentioned, there's a number of different types of domain-specific types of tools. So particularly for molecular dynamics, VMD is a tool that's often used for looking at molecular data. And it has a lot of domain-specific types of representations, like the ball and stick and arrows and some of these ribbon representations and so forth that are specific to types of domains. And again, their tools are scriptable, so you can write scripts that will help you do some of this stuff in addition to doing it interactively with the GUI. One of the drawbacks of VMD in particular, it's threaded, so you can run on multiple threads on a single CPU, but it's not parallel, so you can't run on multiple processes. Or yeah, it has multiple threads, not multiple processes. I mentioned briefly earlier gnuplot, and it's a utility for doing graphing. It's mostly command line driven, and so there's lots of capabilities there for data that's not necessarily three-dimensional or physical based. So look a little bit at, in terms of doing some production visualization, I use ImageMagick a lot for doing annotation compositing. So if I render an animation, I've got a number of frames, and then I want to add some additional information to it. So this slide wasn't really meant to scare you, although I see how it could be. This is actually one big long command line. But if you kind of break it down, there's sort of 4 sections to it where it's taking 4 images that it's eventually going to poke together. And so that's the big long command that takes these 4 separate images, puts them into one image. I think the color bar is also a separate image. It adds all the text. So that was really intended to show you that it's pretty powerful. You can do a lot with it. But again, so if you break it down into different components, it's not really all that scary. But it is pretty powerful. And so I've also used it for doing scaling and overlaying and such. So, for example, compiling these 2 images together, adding all the text, and I've used it for. So, for example, I've done an animation where I took this original image and scaled it down to this small, and then over time scaled it back up, and then ended up with a stack of images where you had that essentially a zoom in of that larger image. Those things stacked together. So for doing movie creation, Visit and ParaView are both have nice interfaces for generating animations. And you can either spit it out as a movie file, an AVI, for example, or you can also have it save it out as individual images. And actually, I tend to do that more than have it save it as an animation, because then if I have the individual images, I can go back and do some of the stuff I just showed in the last slide of combining things together. And it gives you more flexibility to do multiple things with the same set of images. One trick that I've discovered, I actually had someone point out to me. So first I'll say, so FFmpeg is a command line tool for encoding images. So it's a very simple interface. You could make it much more complicated, but a very simple interface for taking a stack of those images and combining them into an encoded movie file. But one of the things that often happens is I'll have a number of sort of segments of a single animation that I want to compile together, and so often I'll do those in steps, and then in order to I want to combine all those different segments into one big movie, I'll write a script that creates a directory full of symbolic links that points to all of the files in succession. So then I can give it one set of frames that says, in order, here's all of the frames that I need to look at. And having them in a single directory often makes it easier, but so that you don't have to make copies and rename stuff. I'll write a script, like I said, to essentially generate a big long list of all the images by creating some bulk links to the other ones. So that's most of what I wanted to cover for sort of this little intro. And so here's a couple of places that you can look at for more information. There's our user guide for Tukey, which again is our visualization cluster. There's the Visit Users Guide, and ParaView has a nice wiki. And Cyrus and Dave will talk more about those tools next. And then there's also the link for the ImageMagick tools. So that's all I have for now. Anyone have questions?
I'm just curious, so you show slices with planes, but what if you need to slice, for example, with a sphere, or what if you need some three-dimensional cuts in various shapes? Do you have any specific tools, or?
So Visit and ParaView both, I believe, can do slices of both specific geometry, I think, right? Dave, I see Dave shaking his head. You can do like spheres and other predefined primitives, and then I think you can also use a clip by some other.
Yeah. So that on the advanced properties of the clip or cut filters, then there's the default is slice, but you can pick others, like you said, the box or sphere. And then on the filters, there's an advanced one, like clip by or at least resample by. You can give it two different inputs. One will be the shape that you're cutting onto, and the other one will be the input field that you're cutting into.
Right. So yes, the short answer to that is yes. There's tools for doing arbitrary types of cuts and slices. Yes.
The figure with the word map you showed in your presentation, was the word map included in the same tool, or you loaded it from one of the existing libraries?
Oh, for the climate one, you mean? Yeah. It was a, so that was done in ParaView, and basically I had a PNG of a world map, and the coordinates in the simulation were lat-long coordinates, and so I imported the image, in that particular case, the outlines of the map was a PNG, and that was overlaid on top of the simulation data, which was rendered in ParaView, but it was. Let me see if I can go back to it quick. Sorry, in this particular case, the outline was from a PNG that I slapped together, and the variable was total precipitable water or something. So it's colored by essentially the density of a scalar field, and put together. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I kind of use the same thing, but not really.
So specifically for there's a number of different tools that are used for climate and that type of visualization, like NCL is another, which is the NCAR tools, have some built-in things. Visit also has some tools for doing it. This particular one was HDF5 data, which actually I worked with one of the other guys at Kitware that updated their HDF5 reader for the specific data.
Are there any issues with I know it's possible, I guess, to export in vector formats the figures, but in terms of the size that you end up with when you export in ETS format or something, have you noticed, like when you have such a large simulation, do you also end up with a large GPS file?
Well, it depends on sort of the format that you're targeting, right? I mean, it depends on how much of the, I think, of the data that you're actually exporting, as opposed to, I mean, you might scale it down if it's going to be for a specific application. I don't know if that's really answering your question, but.
Like encapsulated format, like PPS. I've noticed with some other applications, depending on what was the raw data, it might actually generate a large GPS figure, sometimes like 100 megabytes. And you can do almost nothing with that.
Right, so I think it's dependent on the tool that you use. I mean, I think both Visit and ParaView, if you're exporting those types of images, I'm guessing there's different controls. Is that right, Dave? Dave's?
Yeah. So it would depend to a large extent on how much is saved off as a raster within the EPS. The more of it which isn't, like in that object, if these are all images, you save off the metadata for each pixel in text, then yeah, it is going to explode. But if parts of it are exported as a raster, then the file size is going to be about the same, but then you're not getting the same benefit of the expandability and shrinkability of it. So best thing is to try it. Just go to File, Export in ParaView into different formats and play with them and see and experiment with what the options are. Certainly for just adding like the EPS of just text and annotations and functions, then it's no problem. But it can certainly if it's doing too much as a raster or not as a raster.
Can you summarize that for the?
Yeah. So Dave was explaining that depending on what portion of the image is rasterized versus not. So, for example, in an image that's highly annotated, the text is easily scalable as an encapsulated thing. But whereas if it's an image that has a lot of pixels in it, you probably don't want to have the data for every pixel, the expandable data for every pixel involved. If you export that as that part as an image, that's going to keep as rasterized information. It's going to keep the data, the image size down. Okay, so if there's no more questions, actually I see a question in the back.
Yeah, from the back. So we, in our program, our simulation program, we export our data, save our data as an XML format. Mm-hmm. And I heard you talking about this XDMF format. And I'm wondering if there would be some way we could sort of bridge that gap where our format would be readable by anything that could read XDMF. So that's the first part of my question. And then the second part is just, do you guys have a high-performance parallel writer for XDMF and reader for XDMF data that could really, scale to the BlueD machine?
I think I'm going to redirect that to Dave because he's actually one of the XDMF developers.
So we're currently wrapping up the XDMF 3. The Argonne, ARL is the primary developers of XDMF itself. And we've just committed in the master the new version, so XDMF 3, and it definitely is faster, at least on the reader end. On the writer end, we haven't done as much work to profile and benchmark, so I don't think that it's any faster right now, or any more scalable as far as the writer is concerned. But definitely the reader is. As far as bridging between the two formats, I know that the new version of libXDMF is a lot more flexible both on the back-end side and on the front-end side. So the back-end side flexibility has always been there. The front-end side is a new feature. So ask on the XDMF mailing list, and then hopefully we or any of the XDMF users and developers will get back to you on specific questions.